You surface from the underground at Piccadilly Circus.
Mind the gap.
Making your way through the glittering lights of London's West End, you take a turn down a quaint-looking street into the notorious neighborhood of Soho. The lights are up, the crowd is buzzing, and you just stepped into the best seat in the house. Welcome to The Big Smoke, a variety show podcast. I'm Kevin Bennett, and I'll be your guide through this experience of comedy, conversation, and community. This week, we hover through the fog and filthy air to ask what it means to fear, to hope, and to keep our courage when the nights grow long. First, I sit down with historian and author Robert Peckham, whose work uncovers how fear has shaped everything from monarchies to modern democracies, and how in its shadows we sometimes discover courage and freedom. Then, on our Parish Noticeboard, we meet André Rostant, a big issue vendor, reminding us that the heart of the city still beats on the street corners where stories are sold. From there, we cross the ocean from one river to another, where our new Canadian correspondent Taninli Wright introduces us to the Wet'suwet'en Nation. And finally, as the fire crackles low and the tea steeps just right, comedian and philosopher Farrow joins us with his musings on fear, humor, and the rituals that help us laugh in the dark. But first, let's break the ice with a little pub quiz. This round, Maple Leaf or Make Believe? Here's how the game works. I will read out 3 different Canadian news headlines. One of these headlines is the real thing, Maple Leaf. The rest, make believe. Can you figure out which one is real? Here are the headlines. Headline number 1 from the Nanaimo News Bulletin. Neighbors in Nanaimo spot beaver using curling broom to build its dam. Headline number 2 from the Times Colonist in Victoria. Group frees Victoria deer with sports net wrapped around its head. And headline number 3 from the Campbell River Mirror. Kayakers free bear cub tangled in fishing line near Campbell River. Think you know which one's the real maple leaf? You'll find out at the end of the episode. It's time to welcome our first guest. Please say hello to writer and historian Robert Peckham. Well, here we are. Welcome to The Big Smoke. Thank you so much for being here, Robert.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I've been aware of you and your book for about 2 years now. Really, it was one of those wonderful discoveries when I was thinking I wanted to do something for a live show, actually, that I was putting together at the time that had to do with the themes of fear. And of course, your book is called Fear, but it also has a very striking cover, as you well know. What is the cover, by the way? Is that a plague mask?
It's a plague mask with a hat on top, a kind of a gesturing to a kind of film noir and an atmosphere of fear. I think it's a very, very evocative cover. I was very pleased with that cover.
It is extremely evocative, and it really stands out. I'm sure anyone who's seen it, even if they haven't picked it up yet, will even just recognize from wandering through the bookshops over the last couple of years. And it really stands out. And actually, it was interesting because I was obviously been doing some thinking and research about this for the last couple of weeks, but specifically all day today, I've been sitting with this and reviewing my notes. And I thought of something that I thought would be interesting to start with in terms of our conversation around fear, the history of fear. Your book is called Fear, An Alternative History of the World. But I found it as I was reading it and as I was really trying to internalize these concepts and these ideas, difficult to think about because I don't know if I'm just naturally more emotional than the average person or whatever, but it was starting to get into my gut. And I was, there's a lot of history and facts and things in the book, of course, but I started to feel, I don't know if I would call it fear, but it was an uncomfortable thing to have to contend with. Do you find that you get a lot of difficult responses or people responding in unusual ways? Or do you suddenly find yourself in, maybe uncomfortable conversations because this is a topic people don't love to talk about?
I think fear is a very polarizing and polarized topic, and people feel very strongly about fear in different ways. And part of the project, part of writing the book, was to explore, in a sense, the ways in which fear is polarizing society at the moment. So, yes, it is dense. It's a 700-year history. It's an intellectual history. It's a social and political history. And one of the things that frustrated me, I think that it was a major impetus for writing the book, was that fear often gets compartmentalized. So it's either a sort of neurobiological phenomenon, there are intellectual histories, there's social histories, but they're very rarely brought together, and I wanted to sort of bring them together. And part of the story is how people in the past have thought about fear. So I guess that's another interesting conversation where people might assume that I'm making a claim about what fear is, when in actual fact I'm interested in what other people have thought about fear in the past. So I'm not necessarily ascribing my own position to people who have thought in strange ways about fear. So distancing our own ideas of fear from other eras is something that I was interested in doing.
And, in the beginning, early on in the book, you say, the argument I make is that many of our assumptions about the relationship between fear, power, and freedom are simplistic and even plain wrong. What are some of the assumptions and the ideas that people have about fear that maybe, like you were just talking about, are too narrow focused?
I think first that fear is necessarily a bad thing. There are plenty of examples in history, and I discuss them in the book, where fear has been used as a coercive tool linked to tyranny, autocratic regimes, etc. But I am also interested in the ways in which fear is fundamental to the workings of society. That's to say, it's about the maintenance of boundaries that keep society functioning. And so one of the major themes in the book is this twinning of freedom and fear, that fear is not only a motivational force that keeps us alert to dangers that we face, but it's also been a catalyst for change. So I'm interested in what I call the sort of the beneficial, sort of generative dimensions of fear that often get sort of overlooked. When I talk about freedom and fear, this is a very old sense in which freedom, love, hope are linked to fear, because the moment we aspire to something, the moment we value something, we fear that it might be lost, and we put in place protective measures to guard it. And fear is one of those protective mechanisms, as well as a coercive sort of negative force. And I wanted to bring that out in the book.
And tell me what you speak about, something, I can't remember if it's you coining it, or I think it was a quote from someone else coining it, the dizziness of freedom. When we're talking about freedom, because I'm curious about, I think of freedom as ultimately a positive thing. Actually, this makes me think I've done some work in China in both English plays that we took there, as well as putting on some plays in Mandarin when I was there. And I had some interesting conversations that were actually difficult to start, of course, with people about the concept of freedom. What do you mean when you reference the dizziness of freedom in the book?
That's a quote from a Danish philosopher, Kierkegaard, and I'm interested in it because what he brings up is this idea that with freedom comes many possibilities of choices that might be the wrong choice. He takes the example of someone who climbs up to the top of a cliff, and as that person looks down, there's a sort of possibility that they could throw themselves off the cliff. And because it's a possibility, it brings a sort of a terror with it. So I think freedom, the choices that were presented as individuals and as societies, is terrifying. We might make the wrong choice. And of course, that leads to another quandary, which is we relinquish our choice to someone who makes the choice for us. And that's often the beginning of tyranny, that because choosing and freedom is a difficult thing, we make someone else do it for us. And therein, I think, lies this sort of double bind of freedom and fear.
Is there any link to that? I was thinking about when I think about fear from, I guess, an uninformed or just a human perspective of my own experiences. I think a lot about something that's unknown, or being afraid of the dark, or not know, nighttime. I'm thinking a lot about this time of year. It's October. There's all sorts of rituals around fear or scaring away the evil spirits or things like that. Halloween, and I was thinking about how there is so much access nowadays. What I mean by so much access is we have the ability to sort of see in a second on our phones anything that's going around in the world. True, not true, real news, fake news, whatever. But we have such an immediate access to everything. And yet, to me, it seems like it should be an exposure to the issues and to everything going on in the world, meaning it's shining a light on that thing, which should be good. And yet I feel like there is so much fear now. Maybe it isn't fear. Maybe it's a different kind of an anxiety or a different word. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there are two issues there that are interesting. The first is the relationship between fear and uncertainty. I think that's definitely an important one. I mean, fear is one of those words, a bit like St. Augustine talked about time, that we think we know what it means until we have to define it, and then it becomes a very slippery concept. But it's, but one very basic definition would be that it's a neurobiological phenomenon, and it's a survival mechanism, the fight or flight mechanism. And that it leads to physiological processes and expressive behaviors. And these are to protect us. And so uncertainty is a threat because we don't know what lurks there, what kinds of threat lie in this uncertainty. In terms of the technology, one of the things that I'm interested in the book is this sort of the ambiguity of technology. That technology has often been mobilized to control and manage our fears. But it can also become this echoing chamber where fears sort of resonate within this world of communication. I think we live inside an algorithmic world where our fears are sort of reflected back at us. And so what we get is a reaffirmation of those fears, often by being in communities that share our fears. And so they become sort of reinforced. This is something that's kind of interests me, that people often think of fear as shattering communities, but fear creates communities around these shared fears. And so I think that a lot of the social media world is a world which is fracturing around a sort of communities of fear. And so the challenge there is to break these bubbles and to be able to contemplate real fears that do threaten us. Where they're coming from in terms of sort of injustices, climate change. I don't know. There are many big fears that are genuine that we face.
Do you think you can create community without fear? Or even people who do create movements, or I'm thinking of, Barack Obama's audacity of hope, and was there fear lurking underneath it that just wasn't spoken about? Is there always a level of fear, whether it's directly mentioned or not, when groups or concepts are created?
I think there is. I mean, the audacity of hope came as a sort of antidote to fear. In that sense, it took its starting point from a world riven with fear. I think you touched on something very important, which is a kind of hopeful, aspirational politics and sort of trying to understand how we've come to a sort of political world where we only seem to be chasing fears. Whatever political side you stand on, either you're pulling down someone else's politics as a fear-mongering, or what have you, but fear seems to dominate. And there's a sort of very interesting, I think, 20th century history of that because of the traumatic experience of the 20th century, particularly in the Second World War, the Holocaust, etc., and then Stalin, that there was a sense in a lot of democratic Western cultures that this must never be allowed to happen again. And so sort of fear that this might happen again was built in as a protective measure to safeguard the values, the sort of liberal values embodied in that politics. But what happened was those protective mechanisms overwhelmed the values. So we were left, in a sense, without an aspirational politics, but only with the fear that's supposed to safeguard those values that we sort of cherished. So that would be one sort of genealogy of how we've come to this place. So I think the challenge that we face is how it's not a question of getting rid of fear. And one of the points I make in the book is that, that often history is written as a sort of development arc from primitive, dark superstitions that are very fearful to modern enlightenment. And what I show is that no, fear has been with us all the way, reconfigured certainly, but it's been there and it will always be there. But the question is how to manage it so that it doesn't overwhelm our system.
I was reading that you used to teach a class, correct me if I'm wrong, on the history of pandemics. Was that one of
So I was the head of a center or I founded a center in 2009 at the University of Hong Kong, which is a collaboration between the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Medicine. And we were essentially looking at the social and cultural dimensions of disease. And my specialty was epidemics and pandemics. And in 2016, I wrote a book that came out with Cambridge University Press called Epidemics in Modern Asia. And I tried to write the history of Asia seen through the lens of epidemics. These kind of crisis moments that reveal fundamental societal processes and political processes. And it was quite interesting that after having sort of studied pandemics for like 15 years, people's eyes rolling when you say, what do you do? Well, I'm a historian of epidemics. And then along comes COVID and people cannot stop talking about it.
Well, did you become the person that everybody called to get comfort from during that time?
So I certainly was very involved in op-ed pieces and interviews, etc. I think that was very important for my book on fear. I mean, I had studied epidemics, I had written about them, and I edited a book called Empires of Panic, looking at panic in relation to epidemic. Often the threat that states experience most intensely is the prospect of disorder, particularly from colonial societies that I was interested in, riots, uprisings, rebellions, etc. So it's really the pandemic putting pressure on society in ways that expose these fault lines. So this was one of the sort of precursors to my thinking about fear, the idea that it could be this formative element in society.
Well, that's what I was wondering about, which is what was the moment, if there was a single moment, I'm sure there was a gradual progression where you realize, oh, this is a book. This is something, I want to shift towards fear as a focus. And then this is something that I want to say in a book and dedicate all that time towards that.
So the germ of the book was there before 2019. 2019 was a very crucial moment. I was a professor at the University of Hong Kong, and there was a big confrontation between the authorities and the pro-democracy movement. And then along came the pandemic, and the pandemic became a sort of interesting tool which was used to crack down on this democracy movement. So for me, this highlighted some fundamental issues, both as a historian and what does writing history mean in society that isn't free? What kinds of fear was I experiencing and that I witnessed around me? And so I think that, along with the lens of having written about pandemics for a very long time, with a motivational force that really propelled me to complete the book, relatively fast, because I saw it as a very sort of an urgent issue about where we're going as a world and the ways that fear was operating. And, it's still a very, very, I think, important issue in our societies, how we manage fear.
Is part of it that things like pandemics and global catastrophes are real nice, easy ways to quickly use the fear around that and change whatever they want to change?
I think that's right. And I think that's a real challenge for a historian, that it's easy to grasp the sort of crisis moments, but much harder to get into sort of fear that lurks, that inheres within society and that's less obvious. And so I think that's always the danger. And so I try in the book to look at crisis moments that do reveal certain fundamental issues about fear and its working, but also to look at sort of larger processes. So I'm interested in the rise of global capitalism and the kinds of fears that inhere in those systems, communication systems. And crisis is also part of that story, but it's more about the ways in which fear gets embedded inside the institutions that we live within, and we're often not aware about how fear is configured in those.
What's an example of that, if you can give one? I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. It being embedded in something without us realizing it.
One of the issues, for example, if we take a lot of something that's interested me as a historian of disease and pandemics, is the story of 19th century and early 20th century public health and urban reform. I think it's often told as a sort of humanitarian story, but I think that if one looked at it in another way, fear was really the motivational driver for reforming big cities like London and Paris. Fear of poor people rebelling, of crime and disease that might move out of poor areas and affect wealthier areas. So if we look at it like that, we start to see how fear shapes institutions that we might not have associated necessarily with that sort of fearful history.
I was just thinking about fear and our kind of desire to seek out fear in things like horror movies or plays or novels. Why do you think these things are important, and why do you think we're drawn to them? I know you mention Macbeth at one point in the book, which I was really interested in. That was the first Shakespeare play that I ever worked on as a director. What a play. And there's so many fascinating, there's so many fascinating things, even things that once I dug a little bit deeper, learning about equivocation and this sort of idea of saying one thing that's true, but being able to get away with it if you were, the Jesuit priest at the time. And this, you talk sometimes in the book about fear and the double nature of it. I remember the sort of, I guess, being of two minds or something like that. And I remember reading, thinking about the witches and double, toil and trouble. And there's so much fear, obviously, embedded throughout that play. But why are these important, or are they, to us?
Well, in my book, I actually discuss quite a lot of literature, whether it's plays, philosophy, and fiction. I find there's a wonderful ways of trying to understand how contemporary, how fear was circulating within a society at a given moment in time. I'm also interested in the history of reading and performance, the performative nature of fear. I think, that's why Shakespeare is a very interesting way into that sort of performative aspect of fear. But in terms of cinema, horror, on one hand, you could say, there's a lot of studies of horror movies and kind of neurocinematic research that have shown that, it releases the rush, but in a controlled stage setting. So we know the threat isn't real, but it sort of simulates reality for us. So it's a way of in a sense, overcoming genuine fear of a threat.
It's like rehearsing it in a way.
Exactly, Rose. It's a kind of decompression chamber. I think it's very interesting when one looks at the origin of horror movies in the post-World War I period, that they are ways of tackling these deeply deep-rooted fears and traumatic experiences. For an audience to sort of confront things that are kind of unconfrontable in real life. So I from that point of view, very, very interesting. But, whether it's Thomas More writing Utopia against a background of growing unrest in Europe and thinking about, what role this fear plays in society, these are very interesting texts that provide these sort of windows into contemporary thinking. And so I'm interested in not just writing a sort of political history, but really understanding this sort of cultural body of work around fear.
Yeah, it makes me think about what genres and I guess level of horror or grotesqueness is popular at any given time. In later in Shakespeare and Jacobean theater, obviously there was a huge popularity of revenge tragedies and quite bloody oftentimes, but then I think about the day-to-day life of a person in that time, and there's they might go see a public execution as a form of entertainment or something like that. There might be more connection to it, but at the same time now, we see it all on our screens. So I don't know if that does the same thing when you see some horrific thing on your screen when you're just scrolling through and looking at cat videos and something pops up. Does it have the same effect on our brains? I don't know.
But I think it's interesting. In a sense, what this brings out is this extraordinary spectrum of fear. That on one hand, fear is this collective phenomenon, social phenomenon. On the other hand, it's a very intimate. It's a reading and a reading of a book. It's something very private, and so I think that's another thing that's quite a complex thing to do, to tease out in a history, is to try and link that intimate area of fear, the fears one has, with this bigger story of collective fears that drives society and changes history on the big scale.
You mention in the book, the history of fear is more hopeful than many accounts would have us believe. Tell us a bit more about that. How is that the case?
Well, going back to what I was saying, I'm interested in the ways that fear can be mobilized in positive ways. For example, I talk early on about an experience that I had, a personal experience that I had traveling in the Asian subcontinent. And one of the things that I learned from that is that, and I've compared it to my own feelings about the values of reading and art, is that that sometimes in life you have these intense experiences that give you new clarity, that suddenly the universe becomes, you start to see things very, very clearly. But humans have this amazing capacity for forgetting these moments of elucidation. And so you have this intense realization, oh my God, this is important. And it stays with you, but then it disperses in the course of everyday living. And I think that that the fear is one of those catalysts for opening your eyes to the world in a new way. Suddenly you see the world with a new clarity, and it can be a motivational driver. My sense is, my own experience is that literature and art can be ways of, if you vicariously experience that moment. It's what I call the sublime, borrowing from that idea in the 18th century that some things are so awesome that they shift your perspective on the world. And so in that sense, I see fear as the opposite of complacency and apathy, and as an eye-opener on the real issues that matter. So a certain degree of fear, I think, is important. Obviously, too much fear, this is the problem. You shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's no point doing anything because it's so terrible.
Exactly, you shut down.
It's this sort of balance. It's this balance, and I think therein lies the complexity of how we deal with fear.
And it makes me think of, it's a very effective opening to the book when you describe this being essentially a part of this horrific moment. I don't know how long it lasted. Did you almost black out during that, or do you really clearly remember kind of moment to moment to moment?
No, of course you don't remember moment to moment. It happens. You're in the middle of a movie. I mean, it's happening all over the place quickly. What I learned then, and there have been, we've all had these experiences. I think what I learned there and from other experiences is that this sense that one is part of this social world, and yet at the same time one is separated from it. And it's that strange ambiguity of being alone, but within a crowd and behaving as a body with the crowd that I was sort of interested in. And in the book that I'm writing now, which is, my history of belonging and home, I'm really interested in moving more in the direction of history and memoir, and drawing on my own experience to think about history. It's something that's something I'm interested in doing.
Well, I was thinking about that. So you're currently writing about belonging and home. Is that a direct result of writing about fear? Is there something about spending so much time in the topic of fear that has led you to need this next topic?
I always write about crises, whether it's epidemics, fear. No, I think that many people have talked about a crisis of belonging, and there are complex reasons why we've come to this point. I think that we're living in a world where it's a world of globalization and deglobalization, of mass migration and border policing, of AI and technologies and what it means to be human, the boundaries that define all these things, nation states, people, mankind and machine are all are blurring in ways that are very disorientating, and a lot of people feel lost. And so there's a longing for belonging and a crisis of belonging. What does it mean to belong? I actually began my career many years ago, and the first book I wrote was a history of national belonging. It was really the history of how, in the final stages of the breakup of the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire, national belonging formed in the Balkan era, particularly in Greece. And I was interested in how this national belonging was created. And so really my interest in how belonging is made, not found. We create and make our belonging. So I think one of the questions that you had sent me, which was interesting, is the difference between fitting in and belonging. And it's often, this distinction is often made. In other words, the idea that to fit in, you have to in some way change yourself to fit in with other people's expectation. There's an element of fear lurking there, that if you don't behave like you're supposed to, you won't fit in. Whereas belonging is the revelation of one's authentic self. That there is a place one can be oneself without this fear. The problem I have with that is that my understanding of fear, I've lived in many places, and latterly in Hong Kong for 13 years. And I'm now spending a lot of my time in Northwest Connecticut, in a homestead in Northwest Connecticut. And in fact, I draw on my experiences there. In this sort of interesting time in US history of making a home in America as a lens for thinking about 10,000 years of history of belonging. What has it meant since humans became sedentary to belong somewhere? So I'm tapping into a very early part of my career too, which is trying to understand how people become connected to a place and a culture. Is it something that is a fitting in story, or is it a belonging, or is it something that is a bit of both?
Well, actually, I was very moved when I read you wrote an essay on Substack about this. I think it was titled Swimming to Belong earlier in the autumn. And you specifically quote James Baldwin talking about belonging being a result of something that you call conscientious exertion. Can you just talk a little bit more about that and explain what that means?
I love James Baldwin, a fantastic writer and thinker. And of course, the kind of belonging he talked about as a Black American, a very, very painful notion of belonging for him. I think what I'm trying to get at here is this idea that through the 19th century, we inherited an idea that certain people or communities naturally belong in places. And what I think that it ignores is this creative generative process that you have to make your belonging. And so I liken it in that essay to a potter friend of mine who literally makes things. And the potter is such a wonderfully fertile metaphor for creation and for the sort of in touch with a place, right, in the soil. So I'm interested in that exertion that is part of the story of belonging, and that's what I really am trying to write about in this book. And it isn't easy. Belonging is not an easy process.
And you've traveled all over. When was the last time you actually lived in the UK?
I've lived about 23 years, I think, outside the UK. I was one of the early beneficiaries of the Erasmus program in the European Union. So I spent a year in the University of Thessaloniki in northern Greece. And it was a wonderful period. It was an opening up of the world, very exciting to be in Europe. And then what became kind of evident by the end of the 90s and certainly by 2000s was the world was fracturing. And it wasn't going to be like we thought it was going to be in the 80s. And so, that's part of, I think, the backstory to this idea of a sort of belonging, the way our assumptions and expectations have changed, in this new geopolitics we're living in, that have been sort of, in some sense, become more conspicuous after the COVID pandemic, certain aspects of that.
I'm curious from a purely selfish point of view, because I live in London. I'm from Canada. I've traveled around a lot for work, but this is the only other place I've fully moved to and lived. And you've obviously, as you say, you lived in Hong Kong and now you're in America. Have you developed a process over time to create a sense of belonging and has it become easier each time you move, or is it always a different thing? One of my, the reason I asked this is because one of the things I thought was really interesting when I moved to London, I'd worked here a little bit for some projects back and forth. And then I finally made the move. And it wasn't until about a year in that I realized the sort of culture shock that I was experiencing, because I really didn't think I was going to experience it. I thought English speaking countries, I've worked in China. I knew that was going to be really different. Canada, was a British colony at one point. All these things that made me think it wasn't going to be difficult. And then all these things were difficult. And I didn't attribute them to an unfamiliarity, not feeling a sense of home or belonging. So I kind of call it a stealth culture shock here. And I'm just curious what your experience, because you've lived in so many different places.
No, and I love London. I mean, in some sense, London is where I grew up, but I have to say that I thought that I would live out my days in Hong Kong. I was pretty, friends, family, my two children were born there. My work was there, dream work, and then things changed, and so it's partly the shock of that uprooting that has sort of prompted me to think about what that means. So I'm thinking through now this idea of is home somewhere you've come from, or is home somewhere you're going? And I think, there's a very deep-rooted sense that one can never escape from where one came from. And I remember, when I traveled around Asia and people said, "Where do you come from?" I'd say, "Hong Kong." They said, "No, where do you really come from?" So, Hong Kong was never any good. I had to explain where I came from, which was always England. So, is it possible to break free from that? And this is a very, very politically hot topic in terms of the world we're living in now, with mass migration and now the crackdown on the policing of borders. What does it mean to belong? Who gets to belong where? Where should people be? So, in a very small way, drawing on my own experience, I'm trying to think about that historically. What has belonging meant to people? And belonging is an interesting word in English. It's one of the problems when one writes a global story of belonging. That many languages, take Greek, don't have a word for belonging that is the same as the one that we have in English. And belonging is an interesting word, although it's not etymologically linked to longing. It has a sort of longing launched to belonging. So belonging is both backward looking, and there's a sort of nostalgic element to belonging, that one wants to go back to some authentic place that's been lost, but also something progressive, a movement towards something. And it's that sort of duality between back and front and past and future that I'm sort of particularly interested in.
Before we leave the book completely and sort of start to wrap up, is there one you write about, hundreds and hundreds of years of history here that you're looking at? Was there one section that surprised you more than others in terms of how they dealt with fear or what their interpretation of fear was?
I suppose the Black Death chapter was the most familiar in the sense, although I'm not a medievalist, I'm a historian of pandemics, so much of that was familiar to me. I suppose what I became fascinated by was the post-Reformation period in Europe. And part of the story is how a sort of strange centralization of power with fear at its core develops in Europe, and then how that then expands globally. And so I became sort of fascinated by that sort of expanding and contracting dynamics of fear, that fear works its way into the heart of governance as we understand it. And we're inheritors of that. And yet it exported fear globally. And I think that was the in some sense, the hardest part of the story to grapple with. and to convey in ways that were readable. I mean, it's a condensing of much history.
I love books, though, that zoom out and let you see things from that perspective. It helps, I don't know, it helps me a little bit to be able to sort of step back from it. Really, really interesting. I wanted to just ask you before we finish, I was reading about you founded an organization called Open Cube, but specifically I was reading, I'd love to hear about what that is. And specifically, you say specifically about Open Cube, in an age of specialization, we promote exploration and free inquiry across disciplines to address the challenges posed by new technology. So I was interested specifically in that, but can you tell us a little bit about what the work is that Open Cube does?
Yeah, I mean, it really draws on my experience in Hong Kong as the founder of the center, where I became very interested in joined up. I suppose, for want of a better word, we can talk about interdisciplinarity, a rather academic, dry word, and doesn't really capture it, but anyway, the idea that the knowledge and practices are split up when we should be looking at problems holistically, and so what I'm trying to do is take that experience that I had working with many other universities, a very collaborative project, into the world, and so we're basically a consulting company that advises on setting up these sort of interdisciplinary programs. But it's taking a different route. One of my interests has always been in art. And in Hong Kong, I set up with friends an organization called Future Industries. It was an organization that basically promoted, that found space for, in Hong Kong, space, like in many cities, New York being another, spaces at a premium. So we organize exhibitions, and taking Open Cube into this arena. My father was a cancer doctor and an artist, and in some sense, my inspiration is for that integration of art into a broader sense of creativity, so that actually science, basic science, and art making have a lot in common, and it's trying to inculcate a new way of being receptive to the world that technology is in danger of taking us away from. So, I have 2 kids, and seeing them very much immersed in an online world, which is now being promoted by schools, where everything is Google Docs, and to get back to observing and experiencing the world in a much more direct way is something that I'm interested in doing. And I guess that's part of my own journey in terms of living in the majority of my time in a very rural environment where I have to do a lot of things practically.
Where you are now, you mean?
I'm actually now in New York, but I'm spending a lot of my time in a very rural community where you have to do things. I have to use my hands and my own limited talents to fix things.
It's not just the swipe of a finger or the tap on a screen out there.
No, it's interesting. One, the half of the time the conversation is around AI and technology taking over, but you get an hour and a half out of New York. There's no cell reception. You're not very hooked up, right?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's a completely different world. Well, when I was reading about Open Cube and some of those principles, I was struck by it because it made me think in one way of what we're trying to do with this show. Whereas, a lot of media now, whether it's podcasting or social media, and we talked about the algorithms in the beginning, is narrow focus towards what your algorithm is going to feed you more of that one thing, and what we're trying to do. Yeah,
exactly.
Go on.
I know. I think that the big smoke, absolutely, that's what you are. It's the idea of the open cube is the opposite of the white cube. The idea of a kind of enclosed space. It's like opening up the cube to the world, right? Letting it in. And it's amazing if you go around a hospital. I come from a very medical background, but if you go around a hospital, it's extraordinary now, where you have specialist doctors looking at this and that part of a person, but no one is looking at the whole person. So they each know about little bits of a person. And so what's lost is the totality of the story of that individual, of that person.
Yeah, and with media now, it's all divided up. So that there was a fascinating conversation I won't get into that I listened to a couple of years ago on Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, talking about sitcoms, even just 15, 20 years ago compared to streaming now, and how really just the fact that we have more choice in many ways is causing a lot of these issues, because the algorithms are giving us the choice, and we're not all forced to kind of watch one of three things that you have that unify us in a way. He was doing a comparison with Will and Grace and a really popular show on Netflix, the Orange is the New Black, just as a comparison, and it was really fascinating. Well, thank you so much for me. I'm so happy to meet you finally after 2 years of
It's been great. Thank you so much for having me.
When the bells ring out across the big smoke, it's time to wander into our local village hall to discover what's pinned on the Parish Noticeboard this week. This time, we're shining a light on a true British high street staple. No, not Harrods, not Marks & Spencer, not even Costa Coffee, though I could certainly do with a hot chocolate to warm me up right now. Today, we're discovering a social enterprise that's changed the makeup of our streets, putting the spotlight not only on the stock, but also on the sellers. The Big Issue magazine, in its own words, began as a revolutionary act. Launched in 1991 by John Bird and Gordon Roddick, it was founded as a social enterprise in response to the growing number of rough sleepers and people experiencing homelessness on the streets of London. From the very beginning, its model was deceptively simple. Individuals who are homeless or at risk of homelessness can buy copies of the magazine at a reduced rate, then resell them at full cover price, keeping the difference themselves. This way, vendors are not simply recipients of charity, but become small-scale entrepreneurs, earning a legitimate income and some agency. Don't let the simplicity of this system fool you. The Big Issue's impact has been profound, especially as those who are experiencing homelessness can struggle to find consistent and accessible work.
The Big Issue really is a means to an end in the sense that if you're homeless, if you're in dire straits and if you're up the creek, you have not necessarily a means of income. You don't necessarily have a way of getting a job because you don't always have ID, or your circumstances are such that you can't be reliable for a job. But the Big Issue, you can buy it, and vendors do buy the magazine up front for £2 nowadays at a time and sell it, and it's simply trading. You buy the magazine, you sell it, you get the money you are paid for the Big Issue and just stick it in your pocket, and that's that, and you can buy more Big Issues with it.
That voice you just heard is André Rostant, a Big Issue vendor in central London.
I was in a difficult, shall we say, relationship, and it broke down. I was in a relationship breakdown, and I found myself in charge of small children with difficulty in holding down regular work, and difficulty in the sense that I didn't always have cash when I needed it. Cash for emergencies, cash for contingencies, cash even sometimes to put food on the table at certain times. So I needed to find some source of income that would give me a degree of flexibility, because I couldn't be reliable for an employer, but I could be reliable for me.
Regular contracted hours are often a barrier to work for people experiencing homelessness, but not for Big Issue vendors.
The crucial thing about it is you can buy and sell when you can, when you have the time, when you have the opportunity. You can go out and make a few bob, and it's an extraordinarily flexible thing, and especially for somebody who has difficulty in holding down a regular job or being reliable for someone else.
Whilst stories like André's are as powerful as they are optimistic, it's important to say that The Big Issue isn't just a vessel for buyer charity. It's a publication with real journalistic clout. It has consistently published content that rivals mainstream magazines and newspapers in both depth and influence. Big name and exclusive guest features have included environmentalists like Chris Peckham, actors like Michael Sheen, writers like Robert McFarlane, and artists like Jake Bugg, and the little-known Paul McCartney of the Beatles, among so many others. In fact, The Big Issue recently won the Outstanding Achievement in Journalism Award at the 2024 Society of Editors Media Freedom Awards dinner.
This win emphasizes the genuine journalistic quality of the magazine, as well as underlining its credibility. This journalistic punch is a huge part of what has made the magazine so successful. It's not bought out of pity, but because it's genuinely worth reading. Its credibility means vendors aren't just selling any puff-piece publication, they're offering something respected and trusted. The quality of the content itself helps open conversations, build rapport, and attract a wider audience who might not otherwise halt their busy lives to buy a copy. This partnership between vendor and magazine has driven the paper's lasting success. The Big Issue's annual reports underline this success. In 2024, they detailed an 8% increase in physical paper sales from 2022 to 2023, meaning a collective £4 million was earned by their vendors across the UK. But even with the magazine's popularity and strong reputation, life on the streets for vendors is far from easy.
The most difficult thing, not necessarily for me, but in general, in selling the Big Issue, is people. You have people who ignore you have people who make remarks, and you have people who sometimes even physically harass you, or indeed, many Big Issue vendors get assaulted occasionally. That being said, the most wonderful and miraculous thing about the Big Issue is people, because people are wonderful. They're generous, they're thoughtful, and when we do see others in need, if there's an opportunity to help, most people will, and that's a very heartening thing. And you get people who stop and chat. They don't necessarily even have to buy the magazine, but that's a lifting thing.
The Big Issue is a project which has changed so many people's lives. It's not only a chance to get back on your feet, it can be a bridge to other opportunities.
I believe in the Big Issue project. I think it's saving lives. I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's a benefit to not just to the people who sell it, but to the people who buy it. It's just a wonderful magazine. I believe in it so much that now I actually work for the Big Issue 3 days a week as an outreach worker, which is something of the blind leading the blind, because I'm sure I have as many problems as some of the other vendors. But nonetheless, I feel enormously privileged to be able to contribute to the work of the Big Issue as a worker with the organisation, and enormously lucky to have had the opportunity to sell it.
On busy high streets where people often walk past glued to their phones, this magazine and the people that sell it create small pauses and moments of connection. You can find André outside the Pret in Holborn in the mornings or on Carnaby Street most afternoons. But if you don't live in London, there are Big Issue vendors in every major city in the UK. You can identify your local Big Issue vendor by their red tabard, a sleeveless vest, and their badge with a photo of them on it. So, as the nights grow longer and we start to wrap ourselves up, take a moment to notice the vendors on your high street, the people using this magazine as a bridge towards financial stability. Take the chance to connect with them, to understand their story, pick up a copy, and spread a little warmth. It's more than just a magazine. It's a lifeline, a conversation, and a story worth sharing. And you might just find you don't need that hot chocolate as much after all. You can find more information about the Big Issue's work and André himself in the show notes. From one river to another, the Thames to the Bulkley, we are reminded that communities have always formed along waterways. Here in the Big Smoke, our River Thames shaped trade, industry, and empire. For centuries, ships flowed out from this city to every corner of the globe, and now the stories flow back. Transport yourself to the beautifully rugged westernmost province of Canada, British Columbia. Deep within this landscape, along the Bulkley River, is a nation of people who have lived, gathered, and built community since time immemorial. They are the Wet'suwet'en Nation. One of more than 630 First Nations in Canada, the very word Canada comes from the St. Lawrence Iroquoian word Kanata, meaning village or settlement. And trying to encapsulate the rich, complex history of this vast land in one story is, frankly, impossible. So when we were thinking about who could help the Big Smoke family learn more about the cultures and histories that shape Canada, we knew we wanted to begin with someone rooted in a place I know well, my home province of British Columbia. It's time to welcome Taninli Wright, a member of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, to share her stories as they flow from the Bulkley back to our beautiful River Thames.
Hate Soensen. Hello, how are you? Saizozi Taninli. My name is Taninli. I am a proud member of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. I am a teacher, an actor, motivational speaker, poet, writer, a wife, and mother.
So what do you have for us today, Taninli?
I am going to share with you a story that was passed down by Pat Namox, and he is a hereditary chief that's since passed. And first of all, I would like to share with you my name. Taninli means waterfall in the Wet'suwet'en language. My government name is Lana Wright, and the Wet'suwet'en means people of the Bulkley River. And I would like to share with you my culture, my language, and way of life. And most importantly, I want to reclaim who I am. We all have a beginning. Every single one of us. You, me, everyone. Like the story I'm about to share with you is called How the Daylight and Lakes Had Come. It is being told by the late Pat Namox, who was a hereditary chief. His hereditary chief name is Wuragwats. And the story goes like this. Long ago, the world had no sun, no daylight. The people lived like this. An old man who was chief had a grandson living with him. The chief was also an Indian doctor. In his house, he had 2 balloons hanging by his bed. He, the chief, would leave his home. When he did, he told his wife, "Don't let anyone touch my balloons. Don't let my grandson have it." The chief and his son loved his grandson. One day, the chief left for a long time. He repeats to his wife to not let anyone touch the balloons. Soon the grandson came in from playing outside. He asked if he could play with the balloons. The grandmother said, "Your grandfather would not like it if I gave it to you." The grandson started screaming for the balloons and wouldn't stop. The grandmother said, "Okay, I'll give you 1 balloon, but if you get rough with it, we'll take it away." They took 1 balloon, gave it to the grandson, and then he stopped screaming. The little boy was happy. He rolls the balloon around and plays with it. Soon the boy started screaming for the other balloon. The grandmother said, "He didn't damage the other balloon. Might as well give him this one." They took the balloon down. He grabbed it, started playing with both balloons. While he played, he started growing real fast. He grabbed a hold of the balloons and ran. The grandmother and the people ran after him. While he was running, he tripped and fell down, and 1 balloon busted open. The balloon opened, daylight appeared. When the sun came out, the grandmother didn't see her grandson. She only saw a grown man. The man grabbed the balloon and broke it. When he broke it, out splashed the water and formed the lakes. That is how the earth got daylight and the lakes. I am going to share with you the evolution of the name of our people. In the 1880s, Father Adrian Gabriel Maurice bullied our people into Catholicism. He ruled with fear. Who was Father Maurice? He was a French Roman Catholic priest, a historian, author, ethnographer, linguist, and a rebel with the church. He earned terrible grades and had trouble obeying his superiors. He was so bad that he named the village of our people Morristown after himself. Imagine that. He also named a river Maurice River, Maurice Mountain, Maurice Falls, all by himself. Our people wanted to reclaim themselves. We wanted to reclaim ourselves. Because this non-native person, Nito, as we call them, white people, he was the first in our area to change our tradition and culture. Well, we have our own names, and we wanted to reclaim ourselves. We call ourselves Wet'suwet'en, the people of the Bulkley River, or short, it's Wet'suwet, which means first or before anyone, people of the first village. Our nation, the Wet'suwet'en, comprises 22,000 square miles. Population of our village is about 5,000. We have very scenic area. There's the Twin Falls, the fossil beds, and the Hudson Bay Mountain, and of course, the Wet'suwet Canyon. On either side are 2 cliffs. Our people go back every year to harvest the fish for the winter. Angasai, I love you. Masai, thank you.
Are you enjoying the show and want to help us keep it going? Join our Patreon and get your backstage pass for as little as £5 per month. Become a vital part of making the magic happen. Plus, you'll get a peek behind the curtain and perks like our monthly newsletter, special episode shoutouts, a community chat, and first dibs on live show tickets. Support us today at patreon.com/thebigsmokevarietyshow. For less than a Soho coffee, you're helping make this whole thing possible. As the leaves turn gold and the nights draw in, let's settle by the fire. The cat purring in our lap, and a tea kettle on the stove. So sit back, relax, and open your ears to our reflective humorist, Alex Farrow, a comedian, a philosopher, sharing his musings on this most curious and ever so slightly fearful time of year.
I'm Alex Farrow. I run a show in the UK called Standup Philosophy, where I interview comedians about the philosophy hidden beneath their jokes. As I write this, the days are getting shorter and the dark is getting longer. It is well known that comedians are often drawn to the dark. Tina Fey once said, "If you want to make people laugh, dress a comedy writer up as an old lady and pretend to push her down the stairs. If you want to make comedy writers laugh, actually push an old lady down the stairs." Comedians' dark jokes are like little Halloweens, moments where it's a bit more normal to refer to death, where darker things are celebrations rather than commiserations. Spike Milligan's headstone is said to include the phrase, "I told you I was ill." Innocuous-sounding phrases often hide the dark humour of their original comedic inventors. If I tease you, I might say, "I'm just pulling your leg." It refers originally to the practice at a public hanging where your friends would pull on you as you dangled to break your neck and put you out of your misery quicker. But now, it's a phrase we throw about in the lightest of contexts. Each year, there is a hanging skeleton above my neighbour's porch at Halloween. In the past, you would hang a corpse outside city walls as a warning. Today, it is an invitation, one that says, your child can get sweeties here. The National Trust has an advert out at the moment. A young couple look out from a secluded spot to a beautiful autumnal scene outside an Oxfordshire country house. It has the caption, "Imagine raw dogging here." I'm not sure I've seen anything as unintentionally funny this week. To raw dog means to do something without a barrier to enjoyment, and increasingly, specifically, to enjoying something without the barrier of your phone or tablet to distract you. The National Trust wants to say, come, enjoy nature in the raw, without the distractions of the modern world. However, the original meaning of raw dog is to have sex without a condom, a meaning it still very much has. Perhaps the joke is on me, however, and maybe the National Trust very much intends this dual meaning. I hear that membership is in decline, and perhaps drastic actions are required. Save our beautiful national gardens, and lay back, and think of England. We forget the origin and meaning of things at our own peril. Euphemisms are well known. They are, of course, socially acceptable phrases that point to something taboo. We rarely say, he has died. We might rather say, he has moved on or passed away. Death, at least outside of Halloween, is one of the greatest taboos in the 21st century. Dysphamisms are the linguistic opposite. Taboo phrases that refer to something socially acceptable. Say, raw dogging or pulling your leg. Sometimes the original taboo meaning of a dysphomism becomes lost completely, as with pulling your leg, or less so with raw dogging. The first joke you probably ever heard is probably this kind of forgotten dysphomism. Why did the chicken cross the road? To get to the other side. The other side here refers to a Victorian phrase, crossing from this life to the next. The other side being the spiritual world. Rather than this joke being an anti-joke, a kind of non sequitur where we were expecting a pun, but there is none, it is rather a slightly dark pun that since the end of the Victorian period, when it was written, we don't even recognise anymore. In 2019, a Save the Children charity shop near me made the news after it included a headless baby doll in its Halloween window display. Hilarious or horrible? Halloween itself is one big dysphamism, where the taboo references are things we rarely think about. All Hallows Day, where we get the name Halloween from, was an autumn festival for remembering Christian martyrs. Society has always needed its rituals to deal with the dark. In a more secular society, we lack these cohesive rituals to talk about the taboo. The Victorians had defined things like a mourning period with the wearing of all black. When I've lost loved ones, or been around those who have, I've never known what to say. I might say, I died last night on stage, but you're unlikely to catch me saying someone I know has actually died. I just don't know how. When I have a tough gig, I like to think of the philosopher Aquinas, because, and I cannot emphasize this enough, I am extremely pretentious. Aquinas said that a jester must be moronic in demeanour and ugly of face. It is his low status that allows him to mock the king. Perhaps the audience isn't laughing so hard at my jokes because I am too smart and too beautiful. There is something romantic about the notion of the stand-up as speaking truth to power. Comedians all love to see themselves as outsiders, a kind of opposite of the people who rule us. We're permitted to make fun when others are not, to be naughty when we're supposed to be nice, to smile when it's raining, and frown when the sun shines. We permit comedians to be light, even when things get dark, to trick in order to treat. In some ways, stand-up comedy, inadequately, fills a certain kind of ritual gap. Rather than looking for a priest for moral guidance, We're as likely to pick up our opinions from late-night talk show hosts, or perhaps a social media influencer making fun of a politician, or something we all do. Humour has become increasingly connected to morality, politics, and power. The secular person might not go to confession on a Sunday, but we might hear a comedian on stage confess all their secret beliefs, thoughts, and embarrassments. And if we laugh, their sins are forgiven. However, our silence condemns them. Another comedic death, an All Hallows Eve comedy martyr.
It's time to reveal the maple leaf. Was it the hard-working beaver sweeping up for Team Canada? The deer who just couldn't net a win? Or the bear cub on an ill-fated fishing expedition? The real Canadian headline was... From the Times colonist in Victoria. Group frees Victoria deer with sports net wrapped around its head. A group of people concerned about a deer that had sports net covering its face and antlers took matters into its own hands, successfully removing the net with the help of a wildlife veterinarian. And in true Canadian fashion, this wasn't just a rescue, it was a community act of care. People across Victoria joined forces to free a vulnerable creature whose vision was blurred, whose hunger was trapped, and whose life hung in the mesh. You can find a link to the full article in the show notes. Well, that's today's episode. Where else can you hear about the history of fear, a big issue vendor's courage, stories from Canada's Wet'suwet'en Nation, and a philosophizing comedian all in one show? If you liked what you heard, share it with a friend, or leave us a quick 5-star review. Or better yet, become a Patreon. It keeps this parish buzzing and helps us welcome more curious souls. Until next time, friends, we'll see you soon in the Big Smoke.